I'll start recording before he goes away again. Good afternoon, or good evening, or good morning, wherever you are. Welcome to the stream. This is Chinchilla Days. We're reading Harry Potter and the Prisoner of Azkaban, chapter 20, and we'll begin. Harry had never been part of a stranger group. Cruikshanks led the way down the stairs. Lupin, Pettigrew, and Ron went next, looking like contestants in a six-legged race. Next came Professor Snape, drifting creepily along, his toes hitting each stair as they descended. Held up by his own wand, which was being pointed at him by Sirius. Harry and Hermione brought up the rear. Getting back into the tunnel was difficult. Lupin, Pettigrew, and Ron had to turn sideways to manage it. Lupin still had Pettigrew covered with his wand. Harry could see them edging awkwardly along the tunnel in single file. Cruikshanks was still in the lead. Harry went right after Sirius. He was still making Snape drift along ahead of them. He kept bumping his lolling head on the low ceiling. Harry had the impression Sirius was making no effort to prevent this. "Do you know what this means?" Sirius said abruptly to Harry as they made their slow progress along the tunnel. Turning Pettigrew in. "You're free," said Harry. "Yes," said Sirius, "but I'm also... I don't know if anyone ever told you. I'm your godfather." "Yeah, I knew that," said Harry. "Well, your parents appointed me your guardian," said Sirius stiffly. "If anything happened to them..." Harry waited. Did Sirius mean what he thought he meant? "I'll understand, of course, if you wanted to stay with your aunt and uncle," said Sirius. "But, well, think about it. Once my name's cleared, if you want a different home..." Some sort of explosion took place in the pit of Harry's stomach. "What? Live with you?" he said, accidentally cracking his head on a bit of the rock that was protruding from the ceiling. "Leave the Dursleys?" "Of course, I thought you wouldn't want to," said Sirius quickly. "I understand. I just thought I'd..." "Are you mad?" said Harry, his voice easily as croaky as Sirius's. "Of course I want to leave the Dursleys. Have you got a house? Why can I move in?" Sirius turned right around to look at him. Snape's head was scraping the ceiling. Sirius didn't seem to care. "You want to?" he said. "You mean it?" "Yeah, I mean it," said Harry. Sirius's gaunt face broke into his first true smile that Harry had ever seen. The difference it made was startling, as though a person 10 years younger was shining through a starved mask. For a moment he was recognisable as the man who had laughed at Harry's parents' wedding. They did not speak again until they'd reached the end of the tunnel. Cruikshanks started up first. He had evidently pressed his paw to the knot of the trunk, because Lupin, Pettigrew, and Ron clambered upwards without any sound, savaging branches. Sirius saw Snape through the hole, and then stood back for Harry and Hermione to pass. At last, all of them were out. The grounds were very dark now, and the only light came from the distant windows of the castle. Sorry, I've lost my place. Without a word, they set off. Pettigrew was still wheezing and occasionally whimpering. Harry's mind was buzzing. He was going to leave the Dursleys. He was going to live with Sirius Black, his parents' best friend. He felt dazed. What would happen if he told the Dursleys that he was going to live with the convicts he'd seen on television? "One wrong move, Peter," said Lupin threateningly ahead, his wand still pointed sideways at Pettigrew's chest. Silently they tramped through the grounds, the castle lights growing steadily larger. Snape was still drifting weirdly ahead of Sirius, his chin bumping on his chest, and then a cloud shifted. There were dim shadows on the ground. Their party was bathed in moonlight. Snape collided with Lupin, Pettigrew, and Ron, who had stopped abruptly. Sirius froze. He flung out an arm to make Harry and Hermione stop. Harry could see Lupin's silhouette. He'd gone rigid. Then his limbs began to shake. "Oh my," Hermione gasped. "He didn't take his potion tonight. He's not safe." "Run," Sirius whispered. "Run now." But Harry couldn't run. Ron was chained to Pettigrew and Lupin. He leapt forward, but Sirius caught him around his chest and threw him back. "Leave it to me. Run!" There was a terrible, snarling noise. Lupin's head was lengthening, so was his body. His shoulders were hunching. Hair was sprouting visibly across his face and hands, which were curling into clawed paws. Cruikshank's fur was on end again. He was backing away. As the werewolf reared, snapping its long jaws, Sirius disappeared from Harry's side. He had transformed. The enormous bear-like dog bounded forwards. As the werewolf wrenched itself free of the manacle binding it, the dog seized it about its neck and pulled it backwards away from Ron and Pettigrew. They were locked, jaw to jaw, claws ripping at each other. Harry stood transfixed by the sight, too intent upon the battle to notice anything else, but Hermione's scream alerted him. Pettigrew had dived for Lupin's dropped wand. Ron, unsteady on his bandaged leg, fell, and there was a bang, burst of light, and Ron lay motionless on the ground. Another bang. Cruikshanks flew into the air and back to earth with a heap. "Expelliarmus," Harry yelled, pointing his own wand at Pettigrew. Lupin's wand flew high into the air and out of sight. "Stay where you are," Harry shouted, running forwards. Too late. Pettigrew had transformed. Harry saw his bald tail whip through the manacle on Ron's outstretched arm, and heard scurrying through the grass. There was a howl and a rumbling growl. Harry turned to see the werewolf taking flight and galloped into the forest. "Sirius, he's gone! Pettigrew transformed!" Harry yelled. Sirius was bleeding. There were gashes across his muzzle and back, but at Harry's words, he scrambled up again, and in an instant the sound of his paws were fading to silence as he pounded away across the grounds. Harry and Hermione dashed over to Ron. "What did he do to him?" Hermione whispered. Ron's eyes were only half closed. His mouth hung open. He was definitely alive. They could hear him breathing, but he didn't seem to recognize them. "I don't know." Harry looked desperately around. Black and Lupin both gone. They had no one but Snape for company, still hanging unconscious in mid-air. "Better get them up to the castle and tell someone," said Harry, pushing his hair out of his eyes, trying to think straight. "Come." But then, out of the darkness, he heard a yelping, a whining, a dog in pain. "Sirius," Harry muttered, staring into the darkness. He had a moment's indecision, but there was nothing they could do for Ron at the moment, and by the sound of it, Black was in trouble. Harry set off at a run, Hermione right behind him. The yelping seemed to be coming from near the lake. They pelted towards it, and Harry, running flat out, felt the cold without realizing what it must mean. The yelping stopped abruptly. As they reached the lake's shore, they saw why. Sirius had turned back into a man. He was crouched on all fours, his hands over his head. "No," he moaned. "No, please." And Harry saw them. Dementors, at least 100 of them, gliding in a black mass around the lake towards him. He spun around, the familiar icy cold penetrating his insides. Fog started to obscure his vision. More were appearing out of the darkness on every side. They were encircling them. "Hermione, think of something happy," Harry yelled, raising his wand, blinking furiously to try to clear his vision, shaking his head to rid it of the faint screaming that had started to rise inside it. "I'm going to live with my godfather. I'm leaving the Dursleys." He forced himself to think of Sirius, and only Sirius, and began to chant, "Expecto Patronum, Expecto Patronum." Black gave a shudder and rolled over and lay motionless on the ground, pale as death. "He'll be all right. I'm going to live with him. Expecto Patronum. Hermione, help me. Expecto Patronum. Expecto, Hermione whispered. Expecto, expecto. But she couldn't do it. The Dementors were closing in, barely 10 feet from them. They formed a solid wall around Harry and Hermione, and were getting closer. Expecto Patronum, Harry yelled, trying to blot out the screaming in his ears. Expecto Patronum! A thin wisp of silver escaped his wand and hovered like mist before him. At the same moment, Harry felt Hermione collapse next to him. He was alone, completely alone. Expecto Patronum! Harry felt his knees hit the cold grass. Fog was clouding his eyes. With a huge effort, he fought himself to remember. Sirius was innocent. Innocent. We'll be okay. I'm going to live with him. Expecto Patronum, he gasped. By the feeble light of his formless Patronus, he saw a Dementor halt very close to him. It couldn't walk through the cloud of silver that Harry had conjured. A dead, slimy hand slithered out from under the cloak. It gave a gesture as though to sweep the Patronus aside. No, no, Harry gasped. He's innocent. Expecto Patronum. He could feel them watching him, hear their rattling breath like an evil wind around them. The nearest Dementor seemed to be considering him. It raised both its rotting hands and lowered its hood. Where there should have been eyes, there was only thin, grey, scabbed skin, stretched blankly over empty sockets. But there was a mouth, a gaping, shapeless hole, sucking in the air, with a sound like a death rattle. Paralysing terror filled Harry, so that he couldn't move or speak. His Patronus flickered and died. White fog was blinding him. He had to fight. Expecto Patronum. He couldn't see. In the distance he heard the familiar screaming. Expecto Patronum. He gasped in the mist for Sirius and found his arm. They weren't going to take him, but a pair of strong, clammy hands suddenly wrapped themselves around Harry's neck. They forced his face upwards. He could feel its breath. It was going to get rid of him first. He could feel its putrid breath. His mother was screaming in his ears. She was going to be the last thing he ever heard. And then, through the fog that was drowning him, he thought he saw a silvery light, growing brighter and brighter. He felt himself fall towards the grass. Face down, too weak to move, sick and shaking, Harry opened his eyes. The blinding light was illuminating the grass around him. The screaming had stopped. The cold was ebbing away. Something was driving the Dementors back. It was circling around him and Sirius and Hermione. The rattling, sucking sounds of the Dementors were fading. They were leaving. The air was warm again. With every ounce of strength he could muster, Harry raised his head a few inches and saw an animal amidst the light, galloping away across the lake. Eyes blurred with sweat. Harry tried to make out what it was. It was as bright as a unicorn. Fighting to stay conscious, Harry watched it canter to a halt as it reached the opposite shore. For a moment, Harry saw its brightness. Somebody welcomed it back, raising a hand to pat it. Someone who looked strangely familiar, but it couldn't be. Harry didn't understand. He couldn't think anymore. He felt the last of his strength leave him, and he hit his head on the ground as he fainted. That's the end of chapter 20. Only 2 left. And it was a short chapter. 18 minutes. That's hardly anything. Look at him peek his head out of his box. Fuck. No, I tell you what. We'll finish that off this weekend. Leave that at a wee short one. I am tired. I was at work today, even though I got out early. Oh yes, yeah, we were out early for the riots. But good old Belfast rioting. Wasn't even here it happened. But there you go. Any excuse, eh? Just shows you all that in the past. It's all an excuse for violence. But this isn't a political channel. This, well, at least we try not to be here. But we're reading Harry Potter, so you know how that goes. What else have I been up to? Come on, I'm sure there's something I can regale you all with. I like to keep my wee thoughts to the end of these chapters, just so that, you know, if you want to skip on ahead, you can. That's no bother. But the reason I started this was to get a wee bit of practice with speaking. What do I call it? Screaming into the void, if you will. Because it's hard, it is, whenever you don't have anyone speaking back to you to keep up a conversation. So you just have to, well, not spout nonsense, of course, but you have to keep a conversation going, and that takes a skill, I'd say, if you're not used to the sound of your own voice, which I am not. I struggle to maintain more than a couple of sentences on my own, you know, what would you call it, under your own weight. Some people can just talk and talk about themselves for hours and hours, and I just do not get it. It's the strangest thing. It is a bit easier, obviously, if you're reading, you've got something in front of you to go by. Or if you're playing video games, you can talk about, obviously, what you're playing. It baffles me, people who are just emptying their life stories onto the poor audience listening. But maybe that's projection. Maybe I don't like hearing about life stories, so I think other people won't like hearing about mine. Yeah. All good. No, we'll leave it there. It's not going to be a long one, but I'll finish off Harry Potter this weekend, and then we'll move on. I'd like to say I haven't chosen, but I have. We're going to be doing the Goblet of Fire next. My favorite. Well, is it my favorite book of the series? Not my favorite book in general. I have another favorite book. Funny that. I do like J.K. Rowling as an author, or rather her books that she wrote, qualify to say, but she wouldn't be my favourite author, and she's, you know, Harry Potter books, as great as they are, aren't my favourite books. But a lot of series that I've really enjoyed reading. Gets really awkward. Back when I was on Facebook, I've been on Facebook since probably 2013, but whenever I was semi-active anyway on it, I used to be friends with, or rather be in the same groups with, these authors. Some of the ones I've really enjoyed reading, I won't name them, but it got really annoying that, you know, you'd be scrolling through your day and they'd be posting something political and you'd be like, that's not why why I followed you. But unavoidable, I suppose, because the authors are human and they'll have their own opinions on things. I will give you an example, actually. There's a couple of authors I really enjoy reading. They wrote a series, The Edge Chronicles. Paul Stewart and Chris Riddell, the two of them together. I think one does the illustrations, really lovely illustrations, and the other does the writing, I think, at least. That's the way they do it. And it's a lot of books, a lot of series, and they're just incredible, incredible fantasy world, really richly woven. Different fantasy races, they've got their own physics with the rocks, the heat and the colds, and they've got their animals, their catterbirds and their glozers and all this, and they're all the names of them all are like Zuzix Zazix, and you're reading them like, who's this? But they're I've never seen so many X's and Z's in names in all my life, but I was following one of them, and it done some illustrations that I couldn't remember which one of them was, and uh, it was like he was you know I don't even know if I should say. Oh, I've lost my my confidence. Right, let's just say his sexual preferences, shall we say? Anyway, um, but let's just say they didn't surprise me because this was from a guy who wrote about Mama Blood Oak, one of as one of the books. Well, the Blood Oaks in a couple of books actually in the series, but it's a the way it goes is it's this race of, we'll call it a female hierarchy, where they, when they're children, they're very these very cute little girls, and they've got their pets and all that, but they become uh, they grow up whenever they drink the blood of Mother Blood Oak, which is a tree that eats animals, and its roots run red with its blood. And these little girls, they drink the blood of the roots, and they become these horrific monsters. And but the males, continue to be like these weedy wee things, and I couldn't claim to be surprised that one of their sexual preferences was whenever, coming from the mind of somebody who had written, obviously, something like that. Cute little girls that become monsters whenever they grow up, eh? Terrible. But it's just wee things like that you see whenever you're subscribed to these authors. Speaking of names, funny names that you just can't remember. Derek Landy's another one that's guilty of it. And it's funny because they're quite unique. They're not odd names. Like you'll be looking at um, Bliss or Sanguine, or people like these, and quite distinctive names. Not long or difficult to read or remember, particularly, or shouldn't be anyway. But I cannot for the life of me. Those are the two. I can barely remember the main characters. For goodness sake, Valkyrie and Skullduggery. Um, and it completely like not very memorable to me for some reason. But very good stories. He's another one that has a very good fantasy world. I guess fantasy is my genre, isn't it? With Harry Potter, The Edge Chronicles. Very good. Very decent magic system, I suppose, and quite an easy read as well. Their series I have. What have I liked? Warrior Cats. Now that got attention, didn't it? Just because of the subject material. It's all right, honestly. I mean, I could read it for you as a series, but it's just a soap opera that's, they're cats. You know what I mean? There's nothing particularly like it. It's interesting enough, when the alliances and the fallings out, and he's seeing her and she's seeing him, and do you know what I mean? But it gets grating after a while whenever, for example, they save the Wind Clan, but not chapters, maybe books later, the Wind Clan are against them. But I suppose that's just the way it is. But it's annoying still whenever that they basically save their clan very early on, and they're against them. And then the Shadow Clan as well, alliances and fallings outs and all that. But readable enough anyway. What else have I liked? What else is my genre? I suppose I'm reading a vampire romance, aren't I? I began a book, I can't remember what it was. It was something like, it wasn't City of Glass, I don't think. It was something similar, and I was reading about this character, and she was describing this girl as having a pneumatic chest. And I was like, yeah, that's all I'm reading of that. And put it away. And I genuinely never picked it up again. It's like that for some books. You read through them, and first couple of pages you're like, oh, this is something I would like, that I enjoy. Or there's some that just you put down and never pick up again. There was one, I had bought myself a very thick book, and I can't remember, was it Gareth Nix? It must have been. He wrote, do you know Evil Star, that series? And it's got, the third one has like the Yakuza in it. Or, no, sorry, the Triads. Well, at the very last book of the series of that, it is a thick monster, and I got it in like a hardback, and I was reading through it, or rather, it was sat on my desk for a long time, and I was just kind of stalling to start it. But one night I was like, right, I've bought myself this book. I'll try to read it. I recommend that series as well, by the way. Um, the very first one where the guys, he's in that town and like creepy goings on were happening. There's a chapter sort of 3/4 of the way through it, and I remember reading it, and as I normally did, lying on my back with my book, and I was like, this is fantastic. This is absolutely fantastic. I remember thinking that as I was reading through it. It's funny now. It's difficult to remember exactly, what it was that stood out to me of that, but it was a creepy feeling I had, and I was reading the book, and it was like I was there, getting the creepy feeling. And it was, I don't know, just the experience was nice. Well, I say nice, but yeah. Oh, I can't remember what it's called. It wasn't the Immortals. No, that's in Age Chronicles. Oh, I can't remember. And it brings the stories of the lot of them together. Remember, the boy has to crawl through the sewers. That was that was a very descriptive chapter. But yeah, I was sat at my desk and I read a few pages of it, and I ended up reading the whole thing. Not that night, obviously, but over the course of a couple of weeks, I was able to read it. Um, Gareth Nix is fantastic at weaving his fantasy worlds. Read a few by him. He did Mr. Monday, didn't he? That series. Again, another great series. Arthur, I think the name of the protagonist in those is. And I began, oddly enough, with, I think, Sir Thursday, rather than Mr. Monday, as you would expect. But I think my dad had gone to the library and had asked him to pick up something, and I think that had been it that he picked up for me. And there was no Mr. Monday. But I read the rest of them, all except Drowned Wednesday. They didn't have that at our library back when I was growing up. And yeah, the authors. Get him on his wee head. Looks like he's leaning against the wheel almost, the way that angle is. Right, I'll leave you there. Thanks for listening. Um, I'll see you soon.